Well, I hope you all have enjoyed the day. I think we have a very good speaker this evening that's going to speak to us. He's an individual that flew on Apollo 7, and Apollo 7 was a mission that flew successfully 50 years ago this month, and really was the critical mission as far as the Apollo program goes. The Apollo program, Apollo 1, turned out to be a real tragedy, and that was in January of 1967. And our speaker this evening was on the backup crew for that flight. And out of that tragedy, we had to really do a major redesign of the spacecraft. We had to come up with all kinds of new non-flammable materials that didn't burn in oxygen because we were flying with an oxygen environment. We had to redesign the hatch, which was a real problem on Apollo 1. It was an inward opening hatch, and we had to redesign it to make it a quick opening, outward opening hatch. And we also redesigned a lot of the systems. And of course, as President Lieberman said this morning, John F. Kennedy had given us a goal of landing on the moon and returning astronauts successfully to the Earth, doing it by the end of the decade. And with the Apollo 1 fire in January 1967, the end of the decade was coming up very shortly. So it took us a major effort from January through until the next year to really be ready to fly. And the next mission was Apollo 7. And that was the mission that Walt Cunningham, our speaker, this evening flew on. But that crew went through a very rigorous training program, and they were very much involved in the redesign. And we felt finally that we had the spacecraft that it was ready to fly in October 1968. And that summer, George Lowe, the program manager, had concluded that if we stayed on the same sequence of missions, we wouldn't really reach the moon by the end of the decade. And so he came back with a plan in early September that said, if we fly Apollo 7 successfully and it proves to be a good flight, 2 months later we will go ahead and go to the moon on Apollo 8 with that same spacecraft. And he was able to convince NASA leadership that that was a reasonable approach with some difficulty. But Jim Webb, who was the administrator, finally agreed that if Apollo 7 was successful, then we would go to the moon 2 months later on Apollo 8. And so Apollo 7 really was the critical mission as far as the program was concerned. It really paved the way, and what happened subsequently, Apollo 8, and then Apollo 9, which was a test of the lunar module in Earth orbit along with the Apollo Command and Service module, and then a dress rehearsal of Apollo 10 in May of 1969, and then the landing we made finally on the moon in July. But that all would not have happened were it not for a successful Apollo 7 flight. And we showed the video this noon at lunchtime that I think gave you at least a feel for the flight. And as I say, it was, I look upon it as in the sequence that was the start and really the critical mission we had to fly and fly it successfully. So let me introduce Walt Cunningham, our speaker who flew that mission, and he'll tell you all about it. And this is forward and that's backward.
Oh, there it is.
Yeah.
This was forward.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, George. I have to say this, you're so much better than me at this stage. You always talk brilliantly without any notes. And I have to tell you, the older I get, the more notes I have. I don't know what that clue is. Also, I feel very strange and very fortunate actually tonight there's so many people out here who are associates. I know so much of the crowd. There are so many people that could also probably qualify as an ancient astronaut. That's the good part. The bad part is they're liable to correct all the things I have to say. So I'll just have to get started there. But let me first ask, how many of you out there have personal memories from back at the time of Apollo? Yeah. Very, very unusual, I have to tell you. Today, in today's society, when Apollo is mentioned, the public, they will recall, of course, Apollo 11, man landed on the moon. Maybe Apollo 8, the first one that went out around the moon. And Apollo 13, of course, they had a movie about it. But today, nobody thinks about Apollo 7 or Apollo 9. Those were the two test missions for the whole program there. And that's because we stayed here in Earth orbit, which is a nice environment, I thought, to do that. Anyhow, both of those test missions played a critical role in the most historic achievement in our nation's history. That was landing a man on the moon. And, when I talk, for space enthusiasts, the good old days, that was the good old days. That was the time of Apollo. It's what I refer to, and the reason I label this here is the golden age of spaceflight. And the Apollo program was more than just missions, believe me. I will speak both on missions and on factors that I think helped make Apollo great. Motivation, attitude, inspirational factors. And some of those became apparent even to me only when I got older and hopefully a little wiser. Also, I encourage you, I'll answer questions, and you can ask questions about anything. I will be willing to stick my neck out, just try to stay in shape from when I did in those days. And let's see if I can make this thing work. Well, there have been some impressive programs after Apollo. And the space shuttle, personally, I think that's the greatest flying machine in history. And then, of course, we also had the International Space Station, which was the most impressive manned satellite ever, in my opinion. And now, with more space science today than ever before, tell me, why is space not a bigger factor in today's society? What has changed? Well, our society is changing, whether we like it or not. Apollo was a story of exploration and adventure. My generation had the opportunity and the courage to look around the moon and reach for the stars. We didn't shy away from the unknown, and we were willing to take a risk. We were exploring the next frontier. And today, the entire world takes pride in man's greatest adventure. Some of you might ask, what is an adventure? Well, I like this explanation. In December of 1994, a Frenchman by the name of Delage, 1994, he held a press conference to announce that he was going to swim the Atlantic. And when he was asked why, he said, because it is an adventure. And then he explained, said, to be an adventure, you must satisfy 3 conditions. Must advance human knowledge, must have a real risk of dying, and it must have an uncertain outcome. Well, that was the Apollo program, to land a man on the moon. Incidentally, Monsieur Delage didn't make it across the Atlantic, but in 1998, another Frenchman by the name of Lecomte actually swam the Atlantic. 500 years ago, the next frontier was the New World. In the 15th and 16th centuries, when you had England, Spain, and Portugal, they were crossing the seas. They were trying to expand their country's greatness and get around the world. Well, it seems to be working. In 1519, when Ferdinand Magellan set sail on one of the most famous voyages of exploration in history, he had this to say, quote, "It is with an iron will that we embark on the most daring of all endeavors, to meet the shadowy future without fear, and to conquer the unknown." Well, that was to be the first voyage around the world. And as the exploration of that new world at that time was inevitable, 500 years ago, so too is our exploration of space. Actually, the heavens, that's the new ocean today. Space is more pristine than was the new ocean, the whole new world before the voyages of Columbus and Magellan. And back in the 1960s, we reached out for the heavens to open the next frontier, one whose farthest shores we can never reach. And while the voyages of Columbus and Magellan took years, astronauts make that same trip in 90 minutes. It wasn't always that way. Back in 1960, many predicted catastrophe for man in space. Some thought that the man's kidneys or his liver might fail or eyes would change shape. Actually, he may have been right on that last one. In spite of that, in 1961, a group of Americans decided and announced to the world that America was going to the moon. And within 10 years, then President Kennedy announced, actually a couple blocks down the way from us, right here, he announced that, quote, "We will land a man on the moon and return safely to the Earth in this decade. We choose to do this, not because it is easy, but because it is hard," unquote. Well, that statement at that time seemed incredulous to the world. We were throwing down a gauntlet before the Soviet Union, challenging them to a technological fight to the finish. And at that time, not a single American had yet been in orbit. But President Kennedy was willing to take a risk, a human risk. It was also an economic risk and a political risk. It took initiative. It took leadership. Today, that goal is history. 49 years ago, that became another milestone in the history of America. Most complicated thing I'm doing is trying to make sure I get the slides up there for you to look at. Only 193 years after establishing an American flag on this planet, we planted it on a foreign body in the universe. And that took a team willing to stick their necks out. While our managers, engineers, and astronauts were willing to risk failing, believe me, we never thought of failing. We were racing our competition to land a man on the moon, and we refused to lose to anyone or anything. We shared a common dream in those days to test the limits of man's imagination and his daring. And that was an attitude that enabled us to overcome every obstacle in one of the most challenging and risky endeavors in history. And it wasn't just for Americans. Today, the entire world takes pride in man's greatest adventure. Any project as complex as Apollo was requires three things: the resources, the technology, and the will to do it. Well, driven by the Cold War back in those days, all three of those came together in the 1960s, and we went to the moon. It was only 3 generations between man's first flight off the Earth and man's first orbit around the Earth. And that was the Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin in 1961. And today we've raised 2 generations for whom man's first flight into space is only something that they read about in the history books. You might ask, why was the job of riding a flaming rocket into orbit exclusively for fighter pilots and test pilots in their 30s? Well, at the time, it was considered too tough for anyone much older than that. That was thought that only an experienced and youthful fighter pilot could endure the wear and tear. It was a young man's game, or so we thought at the time. When Wally Schirra, commander in my flight, when he left NASA, he was the oldest active astronaut at the age of 43. Today, I suspect that the average age in the astronaut office is probably over 45. And back in those good old days, we were hired based on our experience and our qualifications. We were all highly competitive, motivated self-starters. And as fighter pilots, we had survived pre-screening and filtering in military careers of a dozen years or more, where we spent our lives facing risks. Surviving in a challenging and dangerous profession makes you well aware of where you're going and how you will get there. And we knew that we could depend on each other for our lives. So how did I become one of the first 30 astronauts? Or some of you may even prefer to ask, why? Well, in 1961, I was a Marine Corps fighter pilot. I had about 2,000 hours in jet fighters, and I was working on a doctorate in physics at UCLA. And because I was flying with the reserve squad at the time, I was working part-time at the RAND Corporation. I had read about Mercury astronauts, and I had envied them. On May 5th, 1961, May 5th, I was driving to work. I lived in the San Fernando Valley. I was working at the RAND Corporation, and I had to fly over the mountains. A little before 7, and I was driving over to the RAND Corporation. When I was up there on the top of the mountain there, it was a little before 7. That was, and that was a little before 10 down at Cape Canaveral. And I'm listening on the radio, and that's Alan Shepard's getting ready for liftoff. And I tell you, the last 5 minutes of that countdown, I couldn't drive. I remember I pulled over and I parked at the side of the road. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, liftoff. I heard this voice screaming out there, "You lucky son of a bitch." I looked around, then I realized that was me doing the screaming. God, it was amazing. Anyhow, 2.5 years later, I was sharing an office with that same Alan Shepard. In 1963, I was one of about 770 qualified applicants for the third group of astronauts, and I ended up being one of the 14 that were selected. My observations on our group of 14 may or may not be right. Excuse me, I think we were all bright, healthy, in good physical condition. We were motivated, competitive self-starters with a strong feeling of self-identity and self-confidence. We were aware of where we were going and how we would get there. And I guess you might call that ego. Some may have thought that fame and fortune lay ahead, but the reality was different than that, really. The reality, 3 years later, 4 of our 14 were already dead. For details on that, which I'm not going into, I refer you to my book, The All-American Boys. And why did we become astronauts? Well, it was not for the money. Because I was flying with the reserves at that time, I was considered as a civilian. So when NASA hired me, they made me a civil servant. And I was making a little bit more than I would have. I was a captain in the Marine Corps squadron at the time. So I made a little bit more than that. I started off at $13,050 a year. 8 years later when I left, I was all the way up to $25,000 a year. So I did a calculation one time when somebody asked me, during the 11 days of Apollo 7, I earned a little less than $660. Hell, at 50 cents a mile, I would have made $2.25 million. Oh, and also, I don't know if this changed that these days. Some of the astronauts here may be able to tell you that we had no life insurance. It was too expensive because they were renewing the life insurance, and they got 2 quotes. One, I didn't ever get the numbers myself, but one, if the I think we had 4 of us that were considered civilian astronauts at the time. If we were included, the price was so much more per month than otherwise that they would have been most of the other employees would have all been suffered. So they didn't let us have any life insurance. But overall, believe me, that was one of the world's greatest jobs. The 60s and 70s were, as I said, the golden age of manned spaceflight. And that was like the 1920s in aviation. No, we didn't have biplanes and we didn't have silk scarves that are hanging out of the cockpit. Whoops. Well, let's see if I can go back. Something's missing. Okay, well, with 30 astronauts and 30 T-38s, believe me, that was the last great flying club. We loved flying airplanes, we loved flying rockets, riding rockets. And not the least of our motivations was doing something for our country. As I looked over my notes and what I put together for something like this, I realized how some of you might have a hard time accepting what I'm describing, but I honestly believe exactly what I'm describing here. See, as I said, not the least of our motivations was doing something for our country. And like the feelings of my boyhood hero, Charles Lindbergh, the first man to fly the Atlantic solo in 1927, here's what he said in 1969. Quote, "As a student pilot at the age of 20, when aviation was much more dangerous than it is today, I concluded that if I could fly for 10 years before being killed in a crash, I would be willing to trade an ordinary lifetime for that experience." Unquote. Now that's how we felt about riding rockets into space. And it's a good thing that we did. In 5 years, we lost 7 of our 30 in aircraft and spacecraft accidents. And in the 50 years since that time, I think we've only lost maybe 13 more out of our 30 are gone. I think of that 30 is maybe 10 of us, I think, are left on that. Most noteworthy loss, as George mentioned up here, was the Apollo 1 fire on the pad. 3 good men paid the price of progress, and I lost 3 good friends, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. The very precise cause of that is still unknown, where they got the spark that caused that fire. But our overconfidence, I think, was a factor at that time. Shira Isley and we had spent 4 months as the prime crew of Apollo 2. And but those days we were working at the North American plant in California, working on the design, the manufacturing, and the testing of everything. We had no simulators. We were just growing up with a spacecraft. And as the schedule kept slipping, Apollo 2 was canceled, which bothered us a lot for about a day, and then we became the backup crew for Apollo 1. And 3 months later, as George mentioned, the Apollo 1 crew died in that fire on the pad. Well, 3 weeks later, we became the prime crew on the first Apollo mission, which was renamed Apollo 7. It's not worth explaining how those numbers got in there, but it was that's what happened on it. There's the prime crew and the backup crew for Apollo 1. Here we have Apollo 7, 21 months later. And you look at 21 months after that fire, they had a couple of shuttle accidents. An aircraft that I really admire. I think that their recovery after the first one was maybe 31 months and then maybe 34 months. Our system is changing as it goes on. Excuse me. Anyway, 21 months later, after we became the crew on Apollo 7, 21 months later, after 1,040 changes, I think that number's pretty close. A lot of them were very important, very critical. Some of them were because we had that time that was delayed, and that's the reason we couldn't get a lot of changes before that. But then we got a lot of things that were operational improvements, switches and things like that. Not terribly critical for the matches, but it sure made us feel a whole lot better about the spacecraft, the Mu. Anyhow, after 1,040 changes, Apollo 7 became like the mythical phoenix, rising from the ashes of the Apollo 1 fire. And I remember I designed a patch for our mission, and with Phoenix rising out of the fire, and NASA wouldn't let us use it. So we had a much more pleasant-looking patch on that. Anyhow, Apollo 7 was a very ambitious time to make up for lost time. It was a planned 11 days to test all of the propulsion systems, all spacecraft systems, docking, rendezvous maneuvers, ground systems. And anyhow, to our surprise, Apollo 7 survived the full 11 days in orbit. In fact, it was running so smoothly that they added 4 more mission objectives while we were airborne. And when we got back, as he said, they judged it 101% successful. And Apollo 7 to this day is still the longest, the most ambitious, most successful first test flight of any new flying machine ever. Personally, I thought it was an amazingly good spacecraft. Oh, I forgot. I need to mention this too. Got a surprise when we got back. We had a television camera on board. You saw it at lunch today. They had it. The software has fixed it up a whole lot better than it was when we got there. But when we got back, we found out we were awarded an Emmy for the first live television from space. That was the good part. The other thing I remember Wally and I talking about, we can fly out to L.A., and have a party with everybody out there and get our Emmy. NASA says, no, can't do that. So I don't remember how many weeks later I get a box shipped in, open up, there's the Emmy in the box. That was it, big deal. I'm frequently asked, were you afraid? And I have to tell you, no thanks, I never drink.
Oh, you don't need it?
No. Okay, I have to answer that. Afraid of the mission? No. The only fear that I can recall having in those days was the fear of failure. Each member of our team had the same thought. If this mission fails, it won't fail because of me. We weren't afraid of accepting the challenge, but having accepted it, we were afraid of being found lacking by our peers. Apollo 7 was the first step in an orderly plan to land man on the moon. And they've already been mentioned. I'm glad to see that other people, I heard it today in the other room, and I think George was mentioning the same thing, had 5 giant steps. Everyone on our team understood that plan. Apollo 7, develop and test the command module systems and the operations. Apollo 8, overcome the psychological barrier and get away from the Earth's gravitational field. Apollo 9, test the lunar module. And that was in Earth orbit. And that lunar module had no heat shield on it, so it meant that they could not re-enter unless they were able to successfully join up again with the command module. Apollo 10, that was a dress rehearsal for the first lunar landing. They took that right down to 50,000 feet, roughly, above the surface of the moon. And some people after that like to claim, well, they could have gone ahead and landed if they wanted to. That spacecraft was still overweight, and I can't swear for sure they might not have been able to touch down, but they had never been able to get down there and off and come back with the weight they had on that spacecraft. Apollo 11, they flew that last 50,000 feet, right down, touchdown, with about 20 seconds of fuel remaining. Now, when that happened, we all started breathing again. And Neil Armstrong, Neil stepped off into history. When the Apollo program is mentioned today, you probably think of Neil's words. You know, a small step for man, giant leap for mankind. That's certainly one for the history books. But there were also statements of others for that event that I carried with me for a long time afterwards. For example, and you saw him, he was here, just left. There you're looking at Jack Schmidt, the only geologist we got to the moon. And that's Apollo 17, the last mission. And 3 weeks after the return, Jack was addressing a joint session of Congress. And he made what I considered an accurate observation. When I got a chance to read that stuff, I kept part of it for a while. Quote, I would like first to tell you about a place I have seen in the solar system, the Valley of Taurus Littrow. And then he went on, this valley has been less changed by our being there than we have been changed for having made the journey. Also, you may not even realize today, or some of you I'm sure must, that Neil and Buzz, they carried with them down to the moon's surface and left them there microfilm messages. Microfilm was the smallest we had at that time. So he had microfilm messages from the leaders of all the three nations of the world. And they were left there on Apollo 11. And about 6 weeks after they were back, I got a chance to read those very brief kind of statements. One of them I carried with me for years after that. And that was a statement from the Australian Prime Minister, Jack Gorton. He had about like 1 or 2 sentences of praise, then he went on to say this. May the high courage and technical genius which made this achievement possible be so used in the future that mankind will live in a world in which peace, self-expression, and the chance of dangerous adventure are available to all. I have to tell you, what a wonderful wish. The chance of dangerous adventure means accepting the risk of failure. And if you're not willing to risk failure, in my opinion, you don't deserve to win. But when you do win, you win big. And that's true in all fields of human endeavor. The Apollo program had it all. It had challenge, competition, imagination, leadership, teamwork, technological breakthroughs. It also had its risk and its uncertainty, its chance of dangerous adventure. And it wasn't just the risk of dying. Men did die in those days, and others were saved only through heroic efforts. If you remember Apollo 13, that's the way the world was then. All of the Apollo missions, that's Apollo 13 explosion, that's the S for me. Yeah. All of the Apollo missions returned to Earth. We had 6 landings and 12 men walked on the moon. We advanced man's knowledge in dozens of fields of endeavor, and each mission was uncertain until splashdown. That certainly met Monsieur Delage's criteria, definition of adventure. The world saw Apollo as a technical achievement by men who work and think like machines. Well, I can tell you this, we weren't computers or robots. We were warm, feeling, emotional, committed individuals. 500 years from now, only one event of the 20th century is going to stand the test of time, and that's man on the moon. It was certainly the most spiritually uplifting event in our lifetime. For a brief period during the time of Apollo, our society felt good about itself again. We felt together. We felt supreme in our ability to accomplish anything that we set our minds to. It was an adventure that expanded the envelope of human experience and proudly proclaimed to the world that we accepted no limits on what we could accomplish. As astronauts, we were at the tip of that spear, and we got the glory. But I have to tell you, the success of the Apollo program was due to the collective effort of about 400,000 members of a team in government and private industry. Against enormous odds with the whole world watching, a group of engineers, scientists, and managers accepted a challenge and took the risks. That team changed the way that we all perceived our world. Commercial spin-offs from the technologies developed at that time to make it possible, they are still providing a financial return even today. Our society today seems intent on eliminating risk and looking for the absolute assurance that something can be done before we commit to do it. And we're overwhelmed with politically correct decision-making. Even our space program today is beginning to reflect today's risk-averse society. NASA has evolved into a more bureaucratic and less efficient agency than it was back 40 and 50 years ago. And that rambunctious American spirit of innovation and adventure is being paralyzed by the desire today for a risk-free society. Well, I can tell you this, exploration is not about eliminating risk, it's about managing risk. Today we hear incessant talk of limits, usually expressed as a shortage of funds, when our only real limits are those that we place on ourselves. Today, grand aspirations are usually at the mercy of politicians, and they are possibly the most risk-averse segment of our society. They focus almost exclusively on their own survival, not on having, quote, the right stuff, unquote. Well, we can't just be politically correct. We have to be willing to do what is right even if it is unpopular. NASA has been sliding down this hill for some time, unfortunately. Safety can never be guaranteed when you're exploring the unknown. To venture into unexplored frontiers, it has always been necessary that explorers be willing to die for their efforts. Otherwise, it simply cannot happen. Back when Magellan set out from Spain to explore the globe, he left with 5 ships and 270 sailors. When they returned and made it around the world, 3 years later, only one of those original ships were still in their small fleet. There was no Magellan anymore. He was gone. And there was only, they never know for sure, about 18 or 20 sailors of those originals were still alive. You could say that my generation met one of its obligations. The Apollo program brought together thousands with a shared dream and supreme confidence. They were dedicated, motivated, and committed individuals. They were willing to accept whatever risk was involved and to get the job done. Initially, the Apollo program was all in our minds. And what was accomplished? We staggered other men's minds and expanded our universe. We showed that if you're willing to dare greatly and risk failure, you can change man's view of his future forever. Personally, I feel fortunate to have lived when I did, and I am proud to have played a small role in a historic accomplishment. Oops, that's the end. Last slide. Thank you very much. Thank you. Sure.
Walt agreed to take some questions if we have questions from the audience.
No questions? Did I answer everything, or are you just too much smarter than me? Well, if there's no questions.
There's one back there.
Okay, back there.
What percentage do you think you had of surviving the mission and of having mission success?
He was asking what percent chance did we think we had of surviving the mission? Is that right? Well, you bring up an interesting factor because, rightly or wrongly, we felt we were going to be successful. Does that mean we didn't know the risk? No. But when we thought of the risk, it was only just a few different times within that mission where your life might be at risk. We couldn't control everything. Look at Apollo 13. But at the same time, we added up the various places where we were concerned about maybe the reentry burn or even during launch. I think there was a total of less than 10 minutes total on the entire 11 days that we felt like we ought to be really kind of concerned about that. We felt, I have to tell you, that doesn't mean there was no risk. That's what guides your attitude. The people in those days felt like they would handle it, right or not. I can't swear that was right, but that's the attitude we had. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Because this is a medical meeting, I'd like to know more about that having the nasal cold event and how could possibly be wrong from the cold event.
Within what?
What could have been wrong from the cold? One of your crew members had cold.
Oh, what could have been wrong with the cold we had? Well, I'll tell you the same thing that I always say about it, which is not the same thing that NASA said, for whatever stupid reason they had this. Well, I guess I can tell you why there was a cold period. The only one that had a cold, incidentally, was Wally Schirra. And the reason there was anybody that had a cold was about 4 days before, we were down there at the Cape, and we went hunting 4 or 5 days before on a Sunday down there. It was not legal hunting. They weren't going to open it until the next day, but it wouldn't have had the time, so we were hunting down there, and it was cold and it was wet. And I remember somebody came by and stopped that hunting late in the afternoon. Isley and I, when we went back to the crew quarters, Isley and I were concerned enough that we snuck our way out and got some cold pills and things like that, just in case. We told Wally about that. And nothing, he didn't want to have anything to do with it. So Wally did get a cold. And when we got to orbit, he had a cold. I never had a cold. I never coughed or anything like that. Isley, I think, coughed once or twice the first day, but he didn't have a cold either. But unfortunately, Wally did more communications than we did with the ground, and he was he was bent out of shape about his cold and all that kind of stuff. So I can tell you that I can't tell you how it was like with the cold, except that we had to put up with that too. And he slept a little bit more the first couple of days. But overall, we still did everything we had to. That's why they ended up with 101% success. The spacecraft was wonderfully prepared, in my opinion. So we got by with that. But we didn't all have colds. Somebody back there?
Related to that, there have been a couple of articles published very recently about your mission, and one of the articles characterized it as the first mini mutiny, because apparently because of the cold, Wally Schirra wouldn't let you all wear your helmets on the return, and there was some consternation between the crew and the ground. Okay,
he's talking about, boy, I'll tell you, the cold's more important than anything else I said. Well, actually, we were up there for 11 days, and after a couple of days, Wally was getting back, and I thought in pretty decent shape. But in those days, that first mission was the only time that we had somebody up all the time. Wally and I were together always at the same time. Isley had an 8-hour period. And then of course, there was 8 hours when all of us were up, but all that was moved back and forth so much. The schedule was amazingly horrible from sleep and all that kind of stuff. When it came time to re-enter, Wally was concerned about his ears not clearing. And he's the one, I was going to say, he suggested. He didn't suggest. He says, hey, we're going to re-enter without helmets. He had talked to us about that. And we felt like we could handle the couch without it. But we didn't have to say anything about it. We just went along with it, and the ground didn't like it at all. Deke Slayton, after we got back and got into crew quarters, Deke Slayton took Wally aside, and I think he chewed him out for 5 or 10 minutes about that. But we survived just fine. And I understand, I'm not sure about this, but I thought that after that, they changed the requirement that you had to have that helmet on during reentry. I'm not sure on the later Apollo missions, but a couple of people have told me that they didn't insist that you have to wear that helmet after that. Yeah.
After making revisions to the capsule on Apollo 7, were there any issues that stand out in your mind that were more problematic than any others?
Any issues more problematic? I don't really think so. We were very concerned about making sure our navigation system would work, and Isley was the one on that. And we had a few pluses or minuses here and there. We didn't do everything perfectly. The ground didn't even know sometimes if we might have had a problem, and then went on to do that. But even on board, we felt like it was surprisingly successful because we thought that the instruments and everything we had in there, all the systems, we had one alarm go off one time in 11 days. That was amazing on that, because when you're starting something the first time. So I thought it went very well. Now I'm separating myself from what the public at large thinks goes on in spacecrafts when you're up there in orbit. But so that's, I didn't feel terribly concerned about it myself. Well, there was a little bit of concern on re-entry because we couldn't see our parachutes. So we had to go by the rate of descent, but looking at our clocks on that. We couldn't see when the drogue chutes came out at about 22,000 feet because we were in the clouds. And the main chutes were opening, I think, at 10 or 11,000 feet. We couldn't see them after the main parachutes opened. We couldn't see them, so we checking our descent rate again. We finally broke out of the clouds at about 500 feet, and sure enough, there were the parachutes spliced down, turned over. So it was all went very nice. I feel a little bit guilty taking credit for such a tough mission when we didn't really have a big problem on it. Wait, there was one little problem, because when we turned over, we had to inflate the bags that were on the top of the spacecraft to turn us back over. And Don Isley was supposed to do that. He was in the center couch. He was supposed to get out and do that. And we were turned over for just a couple minutes because you had to let it cool down. And I says, Don, aren't you going to, turn on the inflation system down here? And he says, well, do you think we need it? So, Wally and I said, yeah, we sure do. And he had turned to me and says, Walt, will you get down there and do that? He was about ready to get sick, bouncing around in the ocean. I thought, oh, well, okay. So I went down, did it. I got back up, and I was worried about getting sick, too. Seasick. But I didn't. Well, everybody knows all the answers. Thank you very much.